Hey everybody, welcome to the Level Head Show. My name is Lucas Turner, and today I'm going to be talking about 6 things that you need to consider if you're going to be making a podcast. So, the first consideration for creating your podcast is going to be branding. Brand your podcast. So, the first thing is going to be your name. My advice for that is to kind of brainstorm and write down multiple different names and sort of workshop them. But even more important than coming up with a name that just sounds cool to you is coming up with a name that is easy to search in iTunes. So if you use a really big word that most people don't know how to spell, and trust me, there are plenty of words that most people don't know how to spell. If you're doing that with your podcast, then people are going to have a hard time finding your podcast. But there's something else that you have to consider when you're naming your podcast, which is, are there a bunch of podcasts that already have a name similar to mine? For example, if you name your podcast Level Head Show, one of the first things that you should do is go into iTunes or Apple Podcasts or Stitcher or wherever you listen to podcasts and search for the name of that podcast. So I would go search Level Head Show and see what comes up. Obviously, if there's already a podcast named Level Head Show, well, then I'm not going to be able to take that name. So I'm going to have to come up with something different. But even beyond that, I would say if there's a bunch of podcasts that have very similar names, now you're dealing with a bunch of competition. The next thing that you need to come up with is a tagline for your podcast. And this is applicable in so many different places. It basically just needs to be a 1 or 2 sentence description of what your podcast is. Lastly, under branding, we want to talk about image. The cover art of your podcast. So here's a technical thing. The cover art of your podcast has to be 1500 by 1500 pixels. So come up with artwork that can fit into that framework. If you are an artist or if you feel confident in designing something that you think will look good in the podcast feed or in the search engine for podcasts, then absolutely go ahead and make that. If you don't feel confident, then, maybe spend a little money and hire a graphic designer to help you out, because that image is going to be one of the first things that people see related to your podcast, people who don't know your podcast, and it may influence their decision of whether or not to listen. Now we need to talk about the format. How long is your podcast going to be on average? Are you going to be doing seasonal or standalone episodes? Then what is the actual format of your show? Is it going to be interviews? Is it just going to be you talking to no one like I'm doing right now? Is it going to be nonfiction where you're reporting on a story that actually happened? Is it going to be a fiction where you're making up a story or any other thing? You really just have to come up with a general idea of what that format's going to be and sort of put it on paper. And then lastly, under format, you need to consider music. What kind of music are you going to put in, and where are you going to find that music? So quick shout out to great places to find music. One is going to be freesound.org. There's also a lot of sound effects on there. Just so much cool stuff that you can find for using in your podcast. So please go check out freesound.org, I think is what it is. I'll put a link in the description. And then the other place that I like to go a lot is Free Music Archive. Obviously, check out the licensing for the music. Make sure it's okay for you to use that stuff. If you're making a podcast that you plan to make money with, obviously don't use something that is not available for commercial use. But I'm not getting into licensing right now. Let's keep moving. Next, we have the structure of your podcast. So how is your podcast going to start? More often than not, podcasts are structured with an intro where you say, hey, everybody, welcome to the podcast. This week, we're going to be talking about A, B, and C. It's a great place to leave shout outs to people who have been listening to your podcast. It's a great place to promote any upcoming events or, other related things to the podcast that you want your audience to know about. And then you can transition from there into the main section of your podcast. Just no specific way that you have to do it. So I encourage you to be creative thinking about that structure, but do try and come up with the basic outline of what your podcast is going to be. And if it changes over time, that's okay. All right, so that gets us through the second thing. On to the third consideration, the technical setup of your podcast. you need to think about what kind of equipment you are going to be recording with. In terms of equipment, you have to think about your budget. Like, I think you can get some pretty decent equipment for $150. I feel like that's a great budget to get a podcast started. If you have a laptop, then already, or a desktop, or just a computer, then you can get a USB microphone for good $70. I usually recommend the ATR 2100 because I think it is a nice versatile microphone. It's sturdy. And if you ever want to use it as a professional XLR microphone, you have that option. If you have a smartphone or an iPad or something like that, you can purchase microphones that plug into the lightning port of those devices. And then all of a sudden, now you have like a super mobile recording studio that you can just take with you wherever you go. So if you can get $150 or so together, you can basically get started with podcasting. But it is important to consider, like, if you want to be interviewing people, you may want to spend a little bit more money. But at the end of the day, if you don't have any money to spend and all you have is your phone, you can still get started podcasting. The second thing under technical setup is hosting. Where are you going to host your podcast? So I mentioned Anchor before. It's a good place to host podcasts. You can even edit your podcast outside of Anchor and then upload it to Anchor and kind of use that as a space for your podcast. I use SoundCloud a lot. And one of the reasons I like using SoundCloud, especially for new podcasts, is that they give you 180 minutes free upload time. So if you have a 1 hour long podcast, that'll give you your first 3 episodes free. And then if you decide you want to keep podcasting, you can spend 130 to 140, and it's always fluctuating. You can spend that money to get that hosting service paid for the entire year. So really, that's only like $10 a month. So I think that's completely worth it. I like the way SoundCloud works. I think it's pretty simple. A lot of people don't like SoundCloud for podcasting. So there's also a million others. There's Libsyn, there's Podbean, there's Buzzsprout, but there's a lot. And then the last thing for technical setup is going to be the RSS submission process. So you actually want to take your RSS feed and submit it to iTunes, Google, Stitcher, Spotify, TuneIn, and whatever other places you want. But those are, typically the ones that I submit to. All right, that brings us to the fourth thing. So the fourth thing is recording. How do you get good sounding audio? So there are 4 things. The first thing is gain. It's also known as mic sensitivity or mic level. So if you're working with any kind of equipment that allows you to set the level of your microphone, that is the most important setting. You have to give your microphone enough gain, enough volume to be able to work properly. The next thing is distance. How far away are you from that microphone? If you're too far away, it's going to sound echoey. If you're too close, it's going to sound bassy. I have found that most people get too far away from the microphone as opposed to too close. And honestly, being too close, in my opinion, is not as bad as being too far away. So make sure that you're close enough to your microphone. The next thing is direction. Make sure your microphone's facing the right way, or that you're facing the right way. Okay, I'm just gonna look over here for a second, and you're gonna see the difference in the volume of what I'm talking. Or maybe I'm just gonna look over here. You can see the difference. Or if I'm actually talking directly towards the microphone, it makes a huge difference in that signal to noise ratio. And then the last thing for making good audio is projection. You have to project into your microphone if you want it to work. And if you're scared to project into your microphone, then you might be too scared to be making a podcast. Look, it's fine if you're not super loud, if you're not a super loud person, but I know enough about microphones to be able to tell you that they work best when you project. So think of it like this. Podcasting can be a really great opportunity for you to learn public speaking skills and practice those public speaking skills in a space that is non-threatening. I am in a room by myself right now, talking into a microphone, and I'm not seeing the faces of people out there looking at me and thinking I'm ridiculous. And I'm sure that some of you are watching me thinking I'm ridiculous, and that's fine because I can't see you. And this is one of the best things about podcasting is that you get this practice in projecting your voice, and it really can affect your life outside of podcasting in that all of a sudden now, if you ever get a public speaking gig, you've had the practice of projecting into a microphone, and that can make such a huge difference in how people perceive you. And I just think that's huge. So I know I'm getting off on a tangent here, but projection is huge. So now we're to the fifth thing, production schedule. You need to pick a day that you record, and maybe you record every day, but that doesn't work for a lot of people's schedules. So it's best to say this day of the week at this time, I'm going to record my podcast. You can do batch recording where you say, I'm going to record 4 episodes this one day because Tuesday is the only day that I can record. So I'm going to try and record as much as I can on that day. You also have to have a release day for your podcast. So you can say, every Friday, my podcast is going to drop. Every Saturday, every Sunday, every Monday, whatever it is, you have to pick a day. So pick a day that you're going to record and pick a day that you're going to release. Then, if you're starting your podcast, you haven't released any episodes yet, I would recommend that you get 4 episodes done, edited, and ready to publish before you tell anyone that you're doing your podcast. That gives you buffer time, and it's also going to give you the practice that you need to get the podcast up to snuff in the way that you're going to want to if you're a perfectionist like me. And lastly, the promotion of your podcast. So it's good to pick a day and say, I'm going to launch my podcast on this day. I would come up with posts for social media. What I like to do is create one post for Facebook and then adapt that post to Instagram and maybe put it on Twitter. I mean, it really depends on which platform you're savvy on and which platform you feel like your audience is going to find you on. But there are posts that I like to make. So I like to make a poster, like a graphic design saying the launch of my podcast. And it's a poster that kind of has all that information, where people can subscribe, what the podcast is about. Something else that you could do would be a video. So while you're recording your podcast, record a video. And maybe if you're doing it like me, you're recording video the whole time. Maybe that's kind of how you're doing your workflow. But if you're just somebody who records a podcast just audio, keep in mind that it's probably a good idea to take your phone out and capture some video so that you can actually use that to promote your podcast on Facebook and Instagram, where video actually does a lot better than just audio. And then the last thing for promotion is going to be just word of mouth. Tell people about your podcast. Tell your friends. You can even create a secret link to some of your uploads that you send out to people before the podcast is officially live and published, and kind of get people's feedback. Create subscription incentives where basically, if people show you that they have subscribed to your podcast, I don't know. Just give them something. Like give them a hug. All right, that's it for today. I know I try to rush through the last couple. I didn't realize how long of a video this was going to be. So in the future, I'm going to try and focus in a little bit more on all of these things. Keep in mind, in the future, I am going to cover Anchor.fm and some of the best ways to use that service. I am going to get into equipment recommendations for podcasting. I am going to get into more in-depth editing and recording stuff, etc., so on and so forth. That's it for today. Thanks for tuning in to the Level Head Show. Please like this video and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. Hit that bell if you want to be notified about all of the podcasting and other videos that I release in the future. Thanks again for watching. See you guys next time.